Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back into the studio. My name is Eirik and this is Casting in Resin Part 2. Now if you haven't checked out Part 1 already, please do so. There's plenty of information there that gets somewhat glossed over in this episode that you'll need to fully understand what's going on here. I'll leave a link below in the description. For the most part, this episode will revolve around closing the mold and making sure that we can open the mold as well. So let's get to it. Before I can close the mold, I have to make sure the mold will close mechanically, meaning that there's no bits and burrs stopping it from closing. So this means getting rid of anything that will impede closing the two halves. If I would have been more careful while applying the resin, this step wouldn't have been necessary. But the hand is a pretty tight area with little clearance and I wasn't able to do that. Things got a bit messy, I didn't have a small enough brush, if you remember. So I can use my Dremel tool and a stone sanding bit to clean up the edges a little bit. As long as I don't press hard, the sanding stone won't bite into and damage the silicone. All it takes is a very light touch using a tool like this. I'm using an extension as well, that's a lot easier to hold and a lot lighter than the regular Dremel. You can see the regular Dremel itself underneath my arm. I only needed to do this step on the hands and arms, and a little bit around the crown. The body was a lot easier to work with, so I was able to work a lot cleaner and this step wasn't really necessary. You can also use a knife for this job of course, or sandpaper or even a rasp, but I had the Dremel and it makes life a lot easier. And I'm all about making life as easy as possible. To begin locking the two halves of the arms together so they won't fall apart and separate once the mold is opened, I'll mix a thick batch of resin and use a spatula to get it into all the fingers and the main body of the hands. It's a very narrow passage and so I won't be able to stick my hand in there and fill the seam later on easily. So adding thick resin and then pressing the two halves together, it'll fill the seam and lock the pieces together at the same time. This also makes the hands and fingers full of resin so they're not hollow, which will make them more durable and less prone to breaking. I'll also lock the two halves of the mold together by adding fiberglass along the seams of the upper arms up to about the elbow, which is the only area where I can reach into the mold. As you can see, I struggled a bit to figure out the best way to close it. It's a pretty tight fit, but once it's in place, it fit together pretty damn well if I might say so myself. I had done a couple of tests before, so I knew it was going to fit, or at least I believe so. To thoroughly hold the two halves together, I use bungee cords. You don't want to tighten them too much however, as this can distort the silicone. And this is one of the weak points and challenges of doing an open-edged mold. If the two pieces of the mother mold were touching, I wouldn't need to worry about this step. But because it's two edges of silicone touching without the mother mold, I do have to worry about this step. But a little pressure is fine. The resin mold won't break on you, so you're safe there at least. So I think this is a good time to mention Patreon. If you're interested in learning sculpture from me personally and get feedback on your work either on email or by video chat, my Patreon page is the place for you. You'll get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes. We can talk about armatures, supplies, mold making, anything you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out. The link is in the description below. With the mold closed, I wanted to attempt filling up the seam and fill whatever hollow was in the arms and hands and fingers by mixing a liquid batch of silicone and pouring it into the mold. Rotating the mold around and pouring out the excess. The resin stays liquid for quite a while, so I kept pouring it in and rotating it around, pouring it out, doing my best to fill up as much of the hand as possible. The resin stays liquid for about 35-45 minutes maybe, so it took a while. As mentioned before, I also bonded the two halves together by adding fiberglass to the part of the seam that I could see, which was the seam closest to the opening of the arms. But sadly, that footage seems to be lost. And that's it for the arms really. The same method can be used when casting smaller sculptures, for example, which I'll have a video on in the near future, as I will be casting some small sculpture very soon, so you'll get to see me struggle with that. Now we get to the body, where things are a little bit different and the challenges are a little bit different. The two halves have fiberglass reinforced resin in them from the previous episode, but I've been careful to not get resin too close to the edges, which would impede with the registration of the two halves. To begin, I did the same thing as with the hands. Thick resin along the edges to fill the seams as much as possible, especially in the sections I'll never be able to reach, like at the top of the head and the neck. A lot of this mold I'll be able to reach into because it's quite wide open at the end, so those areas I'll wait for and deal with once the mold is closed, but the areas I can't reach get a healthy dose of thick resin. If there's any on the seam, it will get squeezed out as I tighten the mold halves together with bungee cords. I also cleaned up some of these areas again with the Dremel tool, but this footage also seems lost to time and space, so you'll have to imagine it. Okay, new gloves on, and it's time to flip the mold around onto itself. I'll replay this a few times because it looks epic, and because you should note how I put my hand on the inside of the piece I flipped to ensure the silicone didn't fall out or got misaligned, because this can very easily happen. I've also cleaned and removed any debris from inside the mold so it doesn't fall onto the seam and stop the two halves from fitting together nicely. With the two pieces together and lined up, I strapped them together with bungee cords. And bungee cords are great, and for me, they're way better than tape. A lot of people use tape. Packing tape is preferable if you're going to use tape, but I certainly prefer bungee cords for their reusability. Tape is kind of a nuisance as well as it sticks to everything. And saving the environment a little bit each day is a good thing to be doing, I guess. To begin locking the two halves together, I used thick resin and apply it with a spatula to the seams. For those unfamiliar, the seams is where the two halves of the mold meet. My phone's flashlight really helps at doing this, so I can see deep into the mold, deep into the dark areas of the mold, and spot any areas where I need to fill the seam. I try to get to everywhere, though it's not really that easy with such a deep mold, which is why we use the thick resin before we close the mold, remember? You can also have someone help you, of course, and use the flashlight for you, and also shine the flashlight along the seam from the outside. And wherever there's a gap, it'll be very easy to spot it because the light will shine through, and so it becomes easy to figure out where to add resin. So shining a light along the outside seam can really help clarify where the seam is and where you need to apply the thick resin to fill the seam. And this is another good reason to do an open-edged mold where the silicone is exposed. Once the thick resin has filled the seams and is set up, I go back over as much of the seam as I can reach and fiberglass over it. This ensures the two halves will never come apart. You can see how I work with fiberglass in the last episode, and the link is below in the description, so you can see how I apply fiberglass. I try to get as far into the mold as possible while doing this, so that I cover as much of the seam as I can get to with fiberglass. It's very tricky to work upside down like this, and it's not easy, and it's very tiring. I should have perhaps also used a painter's sleeve or a long sleeve shirt or something like that. As you can see, my arms are covered in this stuff and it doesn't come off easy. Wash off as much of it as you can before it sets up. It dissolves in water before it's cured. But don't do it in the sink, you'll clog the sink. Use a splash bucket, which you should use to clean your tools and brushes anyway, so always keep a splash bucket around to clean your hands and your tools. In this case, I waited a full day for the resin to properly cure. Now this is probably overly cautious, as the resin is probably ready within an hour or two, but whatever, better safe than sorry and all that. Once cured, I can open the mold and reveal whatever ancient horror lie inside. We'll start off with the appetizer, the arms, and we'll end with the major big meal, the body. The arms came apart pretty easy. The cast in the mold is very tough, so there's no real reason to be super careful. And a quick inspection tells me that everything worked out fine the way I wanted. Not too many air bubbles or any air bubbles at all. The seam is fine, it's an acceptable cast. Which means I'm happy, and the appetizer went well. It's time to move on to the main course. Quick side note, never let the silicone sit around outside the mother mold, because it will sag and distort, and you might distort it forever, so get your silicone back into the mother mold once you've opened it. Always keep this in mind. On to the body. I start off by getting all the bungee cords and bolts off, and then remove the mother mold piece by piece. It's quite the rocket ship of a mother mold, so it takes time and a little bit of wiggle. Some parts were very tight, which is fine for a resin cast, but because it's very strong and tough, but could prove to be a problem for a wax cast for a bronze casting in the future. So while opening the mold, I noted which parts were a little tight, and I sanded them down and rounded the corners on them a little bit. And next time I cast him, I'll use Vaseline in strategic areas to ensure the pieces come off as nice and easy and with as little struggle as possible. I had a friend once who claimed all problems could be solved with will, violence and Vaseline. And yeah, I don't know about that one, but you have to ask him about that. This last piece here was a real bastard, poorly designed by whoever made the mold, and it took a lot of effort to get off, as you can see. And I even ended up breaking the arm a little bit, but nothing that wasn't easy to fix in post, which we'll see in the next episode. At the end of the day, my NASA-approved model mold with clearances fit for the space shuttle seems to have worked out okay. With the model mold off, I can begin removing the silicone and revealing the final cast. I tried to keep the silicone on the sculpture while removing the model mold for no specific reason other than that I want the surprise of removing the silicone and revealing the sculpture to be saved for the very end. Same reason I start with the back and then the front. I save the best for last. I take care to slowly work the silicone off. If you rush, you could tear the silicone or damage the cast. Maybe not damage the cast in this case because it's a resin, but with many other materials. There's also no fiberglass in thin areas like the ears and the crown, so we want to be especially careful around those because those are prone to breaking. This is the last step almost, so we want to ensure everything works out and nothing goes wrong here. With the raw cast out of the mold and a success, as you can see, the only thing that remains is to clean up the seams, attach the arms to the body, and then finish the cast with a paint job that hopefully complements it. We'll deal with all of that in the next and final installment of the Casting in Resin series. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I encourage you to check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critique on people's work, and we talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. There are several rewards, one of them being the maquette for this sculpture you see me casting today. So check it out, the link is in the description below. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Subscribe and hit the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and share with your friends and family. It really helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching. Stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.